This video is sponsored by scan.co.uk in partnership with AMD Ryzen. This is my brand new AMD Ryzen 5950X powered Scan 3XS workstation. And look at it. It's an absolute beast. I've had this a few weeks now and it's become my main work, gaming and video editing workstation. This is the monster box it arrived in. It was really well packaged and packed with polystyrene to keep everything safe and secure. All the additional fixings, cables and manuals come packaged away in their own little packet, and you get this nice little printout to confirm the PC has passed Scan's mandatory 3XS 24-hour burn and 88-point quality control procedure. Now, before we put this beast to the test and I show you exactly what this thing is capable of, let's first run through all of the specs. At its core, we have the top of the line AMD Ryzen 5950X. That's 16 cores, 32 threads running at a base speed of 3.4 GHz with boosts up to 4.9. It's up there as one of the fastest off-the-shelf consumer-level CPUs you can buy right now. We get a Cinebench multi-core score of 26,379, putting it right up there towards the top of the table. When using the Blackmagic Raw speed test at 8K 12:1 compression, we get 42 frames per second just using the CPU, which means, in theory at least, without using any hardware acceleration, purely using that CPU, will be good to edit 8K Blackmagic Raw at 24, 25 and 30 frames per second. That CPU is cooled by a Corsair H100i RGB Pro XT all-in-one, which Scan have actually customized to show their 3XS logo instead of the default Corsair logo, which I think is actually a really nice touch. Now, moving on to graphics, and it's pretty hard to miss, this thing is packing an Nvidia 3090 by EVGA. That's rocking a whopping 24 GB of GDDR6X video RAM, which means no more out of GPU memory errors for me. Hooray! But as you can tell, it sure is thick, and that's thick with 2 C's. This is a big chunky boy. In fact, it makes my old RTX 2060 look like a bit of a toy in comparison. There are 3 fans to keep it cool and an RGB strip on the side, which isn't going to be to everyone's taste, but it's pretty much a given these days, so I don't mind it too much. And that's combined with 64 GB of Corsair Vengeance DDR4 32 MHz RAM. Thoughtfully, that's just 2 32 GB sticks, so there's room to crank that RAM up to a whopping 128 GB total if you so wish. Now, 64 GB is absolutely plenty for 99% of people. It's more than enough for 99% of the work that I do. But you can't have a big rig like this with 2 empty RAM slots, can you? So, of course, I will be throwing in an additional 64 gig sometime soon to take me up to that 128 gig, just because. You've got to really, it'd be rude not to. All of that is mounted on this lovely Asus ProArt B550 Creator motherboard, featuring dual PCIe 4.0 slots to allow for a dual GPU setup if you so wish, and dual M.2 sockets for super fast NVMe storage drive, of which we have 2. Both are 1TB Samsung 980 Pro NVMe SSDs. One of those drives I'm using for my operating system, which is Windows 10 Pro, but can be upgraded to Windows 11 if you're feeling brave. And then the other 1TB NVMe I'm using as a scratch disk for all of my media when I'm doing any sort of video editing. Now, only one of those slots is PCIe 4.0, while the other is PCIe 3.0, which means that one is slightly faster than the other. On the main 4.0 slot, which I'm using for my OS, we get write speeds of 4,400 megabytes a second and read speeds just shy of 5,500. While on the 3.0, that drops a little, but we still manage just over 3,000 megabytes per second for both read and write. All of that equates to super fast transfer speeds, really quick load times, and never having to worry about the storage drives being a bottleneck in your system. And while it is undoubtedly fast, 2TB isn't actually all that much for some of the file formats that we use in videos these days. So fortunately, they've also thrown in a 4TB Seagate hard drive as well for any additional archiving and backups. You've still then got 3 SATA ports remaining to add any additional drives if you so wish. I've added my own 1TB SSD for resources and games, and another 3TB hard drive for backups, giving me a total of 10 TB of storage. Still with 1 SATA port left over, just in case. For connectivity, if we take a look around the back, we have two 2.5 gigabit Ethernet ports, dual Thunderbolt 4 Type-C ports, 4 USB 3.2 Gen 2 ports, and lastly 2 USB 2.0 ports. If we flip this around and take a look at the front of the case, there's an additional 2 USB 3.2 ports and then 1 USB Type-C port as well. Now this lovely case is a Fractal Meshify 2. And it is also a pretty big boy. Aesthetically, it's got a nice clean black stealthy look to it, which I personally really like. Up front, we have a angular mesh front panel, which not only looks great, but it's also great for cooling. It can be opened up for easy access to the nylon filter. Behind that mesh, we have two 140mm fans to draw cool air into the case, with another 140mm fan to exhaust out the rear, plus the two 120mm radiator fans for that all-in-one CPU cooler. In keeping with the professional stealthy look, there's a solid side panel which helps to keep the RGB to a minimum, with only the slightest RGB glow visible through the other mesh panel located on the top of the case. Now all of those mesh panels and the big fans help to keep this thing cool. At idle, the CPU sits at a chilly 35 degrees C, with the GPU resting an equally relaxed 45 degrees. Now if we give it a bit of a push by exporting videos, running games, or even extended stress tests, the 3090 sits comfortably in the mid-70s, while the Ryzen 5950X straight out of the box sits happily under 60 degrees. Now of course it isn't silent, a big unit like this is never going to be, but honestly it's not distracting at all during normal use. Obviously the fans do start to become a bit more audible under heavy load. The GPU and that CPU cooler especially do start to get a little bit louder. I keep mine under my desk so it's not too obtrusive, but if it was on the desk right next to ear, it certainly would be noticeable. Last but not least, to power all of that goodness is a Corsair RM650x power supply. Yep, you heard me right. All of that is powered by just a 650 watt power supply. Now that was my biggest reservation once I saw the spec sheet for this build. I didn't think 650 would be quite enough to comfortably power these sort of components. But happy to report, I was wrong. It's been absolutely faultless during the handful of weeks that I've been using it. I've had no crashes, no blue screens, absolutely nothing. It's been flawless. Now if it was to crash or have any other serious problems at all, it is all covered by Scan's 3XS 3-year warranty. So how much for all of this? Well, spec'd as it is going to come in at just over $4,000. So it's not cheap, but it is an awful lot of PC. Yes, you could build it for cheaper if you were able to find the parts for RRP or less, but in today's climate, you're really going to struggle to do it. I'm all for building my own PCs. I've built my own PCs forever. This is one of the first pre-builts that I've ever owned, but in today's climate, it just makes sense, even financially. You add in that 3-year warranty, and then buying a pre-built system in 2021 or in 2022 actually starts to make a whole lot of sense. Right, enough of all that. Let's shove it back on my desk, connect it all up, and I'll show you exactly what this thing is capable of. Haha, we're all set up and ready to go. Now all of the tests I'm going to show you are performed in Davinci Resolve Studio 17.4.3. I've got no caching and no optimized media enabled. I have cleared the cache as well, just to be sure, and the timeline proxy mode is set to full resolution unless otherwise stated. I'm using the latest Nvidia Studio drivers, and all of the footage is being captured separately on a dedicated capture card. Right, with all that out of the way, let's take a look. And the first example we're going to have a look at is this timeline here. This is a full 4K, so 4096 by 2160 resolution timeline at 25 frames per second. All of the footage on said timeline is the same resolution, 25 frames. It's H264 422 10-bit from my Panasonic Lumix S5. There's lots of B-roll, a few titles, all that sort of thing. And we can whip around this timeline with no issues, no delay, no problems whatsoever. If we choose any point and hit play, we'll be able to play this back at 25 frames with no issues at all. We're going to give this piece of footage a click here and then hop into the color page. I'm just going to go in and add a new node before there. And we're going to come to our temporal noise reduction and we're going to add some noise reduction. So I'm going to add 5 frames, we'll leave it as it is, crank that up a little bit, bring the motion down, we'll hit play, and straight away it's going to jump straight up to 25 frames per second with no issues whatsoever. We can even then go to the motion estimation type, change that to better, hit play, and again it's just going to jump straight up and have 25 frames per second, no problem whatsoever. So 4K footage on a full 4K timeline, 25 frames, you're not going to have any real issues using the temporal noise reduction. Even if you change the motion estimation type to better, you'll still get flawless playback, and no real issues at all. So let's try a few other bits. I'm just going to remove that node, we'll reset that, and this time we're going to use the magic masks. So we're going to hop into the magic masks area, we're just going to grab the pen tool and we're going to draw across me like so, and straight away it's figured me out, it's highlighted me in red. Now I'm going to click this little icon here and that's going to just track me throughout this clip. Now there's no frame rate counter here, but you can see this is tracking me way faster than real time. 2, 3, 4 times faster than real time, maybe. So that's doing a really, really good job. Now, warning, I'm not going to cover much Fusion in this video. It's sort of a whole topic on its own, but I'll show you really quickly how titles and transitions fare on the edit page. So we're just going to find a section here, and I'm just going to go to video transitions. And obviously all of these top standard transitions will work with no issues whatsoever. Let's grab a Fusion transition. Let's just try the circles for now. We'll pop that on there. We'll come back, we'll hit play. It skipped a few frames first time. Let's try that again. And then it's absolutely fine. Now caching is off, but sometimes it does that for the first playthrough. Let's delete that one. Let's just grab a drop warp. We'll try that one. We'll hit play. That one's no issues at all. Let's come down and grab one of my transitions, the ultimate spin, put that on there, we'll hit play. Again, that's no problems at all. We'll give that a click. This one's useful because it's got some motion blur effects within there. So let's crank the quality up to 10 and hit play once again. And still, it's going to manage that with no drop frames at all. So we're going to let's just grab this background reveal. We'll pop that on there, hit play. And this is going to work. It's only a simple one. Again, no drop frames whatsoever. Let's try the call out. We'll hit play. Again, no drop frames, no issues at all. So some of the simpler titles are absolutely fine, but there are a few which start to trip it up. So let's go down and grab this one here, digital glitch, and we'll pop that on there. Then if we hit play, you can see this one does cause us to drop a fair few frames. So let's see what's going on. Let's give that a click. And we're going to open that up in the Fusion page. Now, if we just come back to the beginning and hit play, down here, you can see we're actually only getting 5, 6, 7-ish frames per second. But what's interesting, if we pop the task manager up, the GPU is barely running, it's at 20-ish%, while the CPU is barely doing anything as well. So nothing's actually being pushed, even though we're not getting the full 25 frames per second playback, which is a common issue with Fusion. Even if you throw money at it, even if you give it all the resources in the world like we have here, you still struggle to get that full real-time playback at 24, 25 frames per second. If you do want to know more about Fusion, let me know and I'll make a separate video delving into some more Fusion stuff a little bit later down the line. Let's crank it up a notch, have a look at some higher resolutions as well as some different formats. Quick warning, if you're not a fan of spiders, they freak you out, you might want to skip this section. So here we are back in Resolve. Now this timeline is 3840 by 2160, so that's the Ultra HD, 25 frames, and the footage we're using is the same frame rate, same resolution, and it's actually Apple ProRes 422HQ. Now as you can guess, we can skip around the timeline, no problems whatsoever, hit play, get 25 frames, no issues at all. But what we're going to test for this one is speed warp. So we're going to grab this footage here, we're going to slow this down to 20%. We'll use this section here. If we hit play, you can see it's really skitty because it's playing back with just 5 frames a second. We're going to come to retime and scaling and go to optical flow, hit play. We still get the full 25 frames, and what it's doing is basically merging the frames together. So let's now enable the speed warp and see what it does. We need to give it a few seconds to have a think, and then we'll try hitting play. And as you can see, at this resolution, we're struggling to get 5, 6 frames per second. Now, honestly, that's not a surprise. The speed warp is super GPU intensive. 4K is really, really difficult for it to do. But there is a quick trick that we can try, which is just lowering that timeline proxy. So let's do that. So now we're just gonna go playback, timeline proxy, and we're gonna drop this to half resolution, and we'll see how this does. So again, we're just gonna come back to the beginning, and we'll hit play. And this time around, we are getting now at 25 frames per second. We're getting real-time playback with speed warp just by changing the proxy mode to half resolution. Now, that's really impressive. If you've never used speed warp, yeah, that may seem quite simple, but honestly, 25 frames per second, even having to adjust to the half resolution is really, really impressive. Now we're sticking with that ProRes 422HQ, but now we've jumped up to true 4K. So we've got 40, 96, that's the timeline, and then the footage is the same. And we've got this footage. And once again, we can click around. We're running at 24 frames this time, so we can click about with no delay, no issues whatsoever. And once again, we're going to go to 5 frames. We'll give it a bit of each and hit play. And again, this is running at 24 frames, no issue. You can change that to better, hit play. Still no issues at all. Let's just change that back to faster and add a little bit of Luma and see what we get. And we're getting full 24 frames per second with the temporal noise reduction and the spatial noise reduction as well. So what I've got on here, this is a 6K timeline. It's 6144 by 3160. We've used that same 4K footage, but we've actually just layered it a bunch of different times. Now the first 6 layers actually has an OpenFX applied. So we've got mosaic blur, we've got invert colors, light rays, vortex, mirrors, and blur. Now if we hit play at this first one, of course we get our 24 frames. The second one comes in, we still get 24 frames. Let's speed it up a little bit. We're still going at 24. The fourth one, still 24. Fifth one with mirrors, still 24. Still full-time playback, still full-time playback, still again now. And it's only when we get all 9 on screen at once where we start to drop any frames. Now what I've also done, sticking on this 6K timeline, I've put all of those into a multicam. So now we're just going to open up multicam. We can see them all in there. If we hit play, it's struggling a little bit, dropping a couple of frames, but still pretty close to this 24 frames per second. We can skip through, just making any cuts as we need to. It actually seems to be the mosaic blur, which is causing us to drop the frames. As soon as we change to a different one, yeah, we do seem to get our full 24 frames per second. So it's all looking pretty good. Yes, it has its limits, but it's pretty solid for the vast majority of what normal people are going to do within Davinci Resolve. Now, let's just go one step further and try something a bit crazy. We're going to have a play with some 12K Blackmagic RAW. As you can see, the timeline res is 12280 by 5112, which is huge. Now the footage is the same resolution, 12,288, it's Blackmagic RAW and it's running at 24 frames per second. So let's just see if we can get any real-time playback. If we just give it a click at a random point, hit play, it seems to drop a few frames initially and then it catches up with itself. There's a little edit point here and now it's playing back. Smooth, 24 frames per second with no issues at all. We can skip around, dropped a few frames just while it was finding its feet, and then it's all good to go. Now this footage, there's a little bit of camera movement. I wouldn't exactly call it wobbly, but there's a little bit in there. So let's give that a click. We'll go to video. We'll come on down to the stabilization and we'll just see how long it takes to stabilize that. It's not the quickest. Obviously it's far quicker than that when it's in 4K resolution, but it is stabilizing that 12K footage on the 12K timeline without too many issues. That's actually not too bad. We'll let that finish and we'll play that back. And we can still play that back at our 24 frames without skipping any noticeable frames. Let's just see if we can apply any noise reduction to that one as well. We're just gonna start off with 1 frame, see how it goes, increase that a little bit, we'll hit play. And sort of half expectedly, as soon as you apply any noise reduction to that, you do drop frames. Even with just 1 frame of temporal NR, we're down to 11 frames a second. Obviously the quick fixed, timeline proxy mode, let's try that at half resolution and see what we get. We're now back up to our full 24 frames. Let's just hop straight down to 5 and see if we can play that back. Not quite, we're sitting at about 17 or 18, so let's try 3. And we're still dropping frames at 3. But again, that's 12K Blackmagic RAW on a full 12K resolution timeline. But when it comes to rendering, it's actually somewhat of a surprise. Nvidia RTX cards actually have dedicated rendering cores, which they use when you render out things like H.264 and H.265. But the encoding cores on this RTX 3090 are either very similar or exactly the same as any of the lesser 30 series cards like the 3060 and 3070, and the same as the older 20 series cards as well. Which means if you just export some regular video that's been cut up and maybe colored slightly on the timeline, this won't export much, if any faster than my older RTX 2060. I took that original project, the one I showed you, my YouTube project, and then I rendered it out using my 3090 using the Nvidia encoder. It was rendered out at MP4 H.265 with the highest or best bitrate. And on the 3090, it took 7 minutes and 33 seconds. I then swapped out my GPU for my old 2060, did the exact same thing, and that rendered it out in 7 minutes and 39 seconds, which is practically identical. It's certainly within any sort of margin of error. But that's not quite the end of the story, because what happens when you take the exact same project, but then you do utilize some of those GPU enabled effects? Well, I took the exact same timeline and then I applied 5 frames of temporal noise reduction to every single bit of A-roll within that timeline. So there's quite a bit of it as well. And then we just repeated the exact same thing. On the 3090, that came out in 13 minutes and 57 seconds. So still way quicker than real time. And then I tried with the 2060 installed, and that took the better portion of 30 minutes, so considerably slower. And that's the reason you'd buy the 3090. Not for the just straight video export speed, but for all the processing power to actually render the really difficult stuff on the timeline, which then does equate to faster renders. But there's still one other thing to take into account, and that's multitasking. I took the same project as before without the noise reduction. I rendered it out, but this time I also booted up Forza Horizon 5. It was flawless. It didn't drop a single frame, it was smooth as anything, and I was able to just play, do what I want, while Davinci Resolve was rendering out my video. Which means I can render videos and I can crack on with other work. I can open Photoshop, I can make thumbnails, or I can just chill out and play some games if I want to. But obviously, that's going to slow down my renders, right? And yes, it did. It added a whole 10 seconds to my render speed, coming out in just 7 minutes and 43 seconds. So yeah, 10 seconds it added for me to actually sit there playing Forza Horizon 5 for the entire time. That's crazy. Now, talking of games, let's try it out with just a couple of games. This isn't a gaming channel, but I'm just going to show you some of the frame rates that you can achieve when using a rig like this. Now, the first thing we tested, Shadow of the Tomb Raider on the highest preset with no ray tracing. In 4K, we managed 97 frames per second, and at that 3K, my ultra wide, I managed 138 frames per second. This time with ray tracing set to ultra, again the highest preset everywhere else. 4K, we got a solid 60 frames per second, while at the ultra wide, we got 87 frames per second. We then booted up Forza Horizon 5 to see how that fared. Using the extreme preset, so the top graphics within the game, the 4K resolution managed 83 frames per second, while the ultra wide came in at 95 frames per second. So it is, of course, an absolute beast when it comes to gaming as well. Right, we're back. So as you can see, the performance in gaming, video editing, and multitasking is absolutely fantastic all across the board, which you would kind of expect for a PC of this price, build with these sort of components. It's going to do everything that I need it to do and more for many, many years to come. Huge thank you to Scan.co.uk and AMD Ryzen for sponsoring this video and putting this ridiculous PC together for me. Special thanks to a guy called Alistair over at Scan, who was my go-to. He's been really awesome and has really helped to put all this stuff together. Make sure to stick around because I'm going to be doing loads more videos on this thing, comparing it to some other devices and showing you a slightly more affordable build as well. So thanks ever so much for watching. Take it easy and I'll catch you next time.